The first time Minnie Kingsley drew a pistol against a living man, her hands did not shake, though her heart hammered so loud she was certain the whole of Doverville, Kansas, could hear it. It was the spring of 1878, and the dust of the high plains had settled thick on every windowsill and every heart in that small cattle town. Minnie was 22 years old, with hair the color of wheat left too long in the sun, and eyes the gray-blue of a storm not yet arrived. She had grown up in the shadow of her older brother, Wade Kingsley, a man whose name was spoken in saloons with equal parts fear and admiration. Wade Kingsley robbed banks the way other men plowed fields, methodical and unrepentant, and for 6 years he had eluded federal marshals, county sheriffs, and bounty men alike. Minnie had not chosen her brother's life, but she had inherited its consequences the way a farmer inherits drought. Their father had died of a fever when she was 12, and their mother had followed 2 winters later, worn thin by grief and hard labor. Wade, only 19 at the time, had taken to riding with rough men because there had been no other roof to put over his little sister's head. He had sent money when he could, always through careful hands, always with a note telling her to stay clear of trouble. But trouble did not care what a man wanted for his sister. Trouble came looking for her anyway. On that particular April morning, trouble arrived in the shape of Sheriff Otis Prout and 2 of his deputies, standing in the dirt street outside the boarding house where Minnie had been staying since her mother's death, demanding to know where her brother had hidden the proceeds of the Abilene bank robbery. "I do not know where my brother is," Minnie had said, standing on the porch steps with her chin lifted the way her mother used to lift hers when the world tried to shame her for being poor. "I have not seen Wade in 8 months." "That is a lie, Miss Kingsley," Prout had said, his mustache twitching with the particular cruelty of a man who enjoyed his own authority a shade too much. "And lying to the law is its own kind of crime." It was Cornelius Fairchild who had stepped between them that morning, though Minnie did not yet know his name. He was a tall man, perhaps 26 years of age, with sun-darkened skin and hands calloused from work rather than gunplay, dressed in the plain clothes of a cattle drover rather than the tin star of a lawman. He had been leading a string of horses down the main street toward the livery when he saw the sheriff crowding a young woman against her own porch rail, and something in him, some old code taught to him by a father who had believed a man's worth was measured by how he treated those weaker than himself, would not let him pass by. "Sheriff," Cornelius had said, his voice even but carrying the particular weight of a man unwilling to be moved. "The lady says she does not know. Seems to me that ought to be the end of it unless you have evidence otherwise." "And who in the blazes are you?" Prout had demanded. "Cornelius Fairchild. I drive cattle for the Lazy S outfit, and I do not much care for watching a woman harassed on her own porch before breakfast." There had been a long, taut silence, the kind that stretches over a street like a held breath, before Prout, unwilling to make a scene in front of witnesses now gathering at shop windows, had spat into the dust and told his deputies to mount up. But he had turned back once, pointing a thick finger at Minnie. "You tell your brother," he had said, "that when we catch him, and we will catch him, it will go easier on him if he has not made us chase him through half of Kansas first." When the lawman had ridden off, Minnie had turned to the stranger who had defended her, expecting to see in his eyes the same calculation she saw in most men who looked at her, a weighing of whether Wade Kingsley's sister might be worth cultivating for information, or worth avoiding for the trouble she carried. Instead, she saw only a plain, steady kindness, and something in her chest had loosened for the first time in months. "You did not have to do that," she had said. "No," Cornelius had agreed. "But it did not seem right, letting it happen when I could stop it. Most men around here believe I am tarred with my brother's brush." "Most men around here," Cornelius had said with the ghost of a smile, "have never had to make their own way against a sheriff twice their size and half their sense. I imagine you have had practice." Minnie had laughed then, surprised into it, and the sound had felt foreign in her own throat, unused as she had become to laughing at all. That had been the beginning, though neither of them had known it yet. Doverville was not a large town, and word traveled through it the way fire travels through dry grass. Within a week, everyone knew that Cornelius Fairchild, the quiet drover who worked for Old Man Sutter's Lazy S Ranch, had stood up to Sheriff Prout on behalf of Wade Kingsley's sister. Some folks thought him a fool for it. Others, particularly the women who ran the general store and the boarding house, thought it romantic in the way of dime novels, though they were careful not to say so where Minnie could hear. Minnie herself tried not to think on it too much, because thinking on it led to feelings she was not sure she had any right to, not with a brother wanted dead or alive, and a bounty on his head that grew larger with each passing month. She had learned early that hope was a dangerous thing to carry when your family's name was Kingsley. But Cornelius Fairchild had a way of appearing in her life regardless of what she allowed herself to hope. He brought firewood to the boarding house when the widow Halloway who ran it complained of her joints aching too badly to split it herself. He walked Minnie home from the mercantile on the evenings when Prout's deputies loitered too close for comfort, never saying much, simply present, like a fence post that had decided to grow legs and follow her at a respectful distance. He asked after her, always politely, always as though her answer mattered to him beyond politeness. It was on a warm evening in May, nearly 6 weeks after their first meeting, that Cornelius taught her to shoot. It had happened almost by accident. Minnie had gone walking beyond the edge of town, out where the prairie opened up gold and green beneath a sky so wide it seemed to swallow the whole of Kansas, and she had come upon Cornelius practicing with an old Colt single-action army revolver, setting up tin cans on a fallen cottonwood log, and knocking them down again with a patience that seemed almost meditative. "You are quite good," Minnie had observed, watching him reload with the ease of long practice. "Ranch work makes a man handy with a gun, whether he wants to be or not," Cornelius had said. "Wolves and rattlers do not respect a man who cannot defend his herd. Could you teach me?" The question had surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. She had not planned to ask it, but something in her, some seed planted by years of watching men like Prout use their authority as a cudgel against women who could not answer them in kind, had decided in that moment that she was tired of being defenseless. Cornelius had studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes serious in the fading light. "You understand," he had said slowly, "that a gun is not a toy. It is not a thing you take up lightly. I understand that a woman alone in this territory, with my name and my history, cannot always count on a stranger happening by to stand between her and trouble. I do not intend to go looking for gunfights, Cornelius. I intend to be able to protect myself if trouble comes looking for me." There had been something in her voice, some steel beneath the softness, that had convinced him. He had handed her the Colt, showing her how to hold it, how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe out slow before she squeezed the trigger rather than yanking at it the way nervous hands were inclined to do. Her first shots had gone wide, embarrassingly so, kicking up dust well clear of the cans. But Cornelius had not laughed at her, had not made her feel foolish the way she had half expected. He had simply adjusted her grip, murmured encouragement, and let her try again. By the time the sun had set fully behind the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and burning oranges, Minnie Kingsley had put 3 shots in a row through the same tin can, and something fierce and bright had kindled in her chest that she had not felt since before her parents died. "You have a gift for this," Cornelius had said, and there was no flattery in his voice, only simple observation. "A natural eye and hands steady as a surgeon's. I have taught a fair number of ranch hands to shoot, Minnie Kingsley, and I have not seen a beginner take to it the way you have." "Perhaps it runs in the blood," Minnie had said, a little bitterly, thinking of Wade's own reputation with a pistol. "Perhaps," Cornelius had said. "Or perhaps you simply have more steel in you than most people give you credit for." It had become a ritual after that, stealing evening hours away from the town's watchful eyes to practice on the prairie, Cornelius patiently teaching her the mechanics of the draw, the balance of the stance, the discipline of breath and aim. Minnie had thrown herself into it with an intensity that surprised even her, practicing not only with Cornelius but alone, in the mornings before the town woke, feeling the weight of the revolver in her hand grow familiar, then comfortable, then something closer to an extension of her own will. By July, she could draw and fire faster than any man she had watched try in the town's occasional shooting matches held behind the livery on slow Sundays. By August, word of her skill had begun to spread in whispers, the way word of anything unusual spreads in a small territory hungry for stories to tell. But it was not merely the shooting that had grown between them that summer. It was something quieter, something that bloomed in the spaces between practice sessions, in the walks home under star-strewn skies, in the moments when Cornelius would bring her a peach from the Sutter orchard, still warm from the sun, and watch her eat it with an expression he thought he was hiding well and was not hiding well at all. "You should not spend so much time with me," Minnie had told him once, in early August, sitting on the split-rail fence behind the boarding house while Cornelius leaned against a post beside her. "Sutter will not think kindly of his hand courting Wade Kingsley's sister. Sutter can think what he likes," Cornelius had said. "I'm a grown man and I make my own choices about who I spend my evenings with, even if it costs you your position. Minnie," he had said her name the way a man says a prayer, careful and full of meaning. "I have thought a great deal on this. I do not care what it costs me. I have not felt this alive in years, and I am not fool enough to walk away from it because a rancher or a sheriff or the whole of Doverville thinks it unwise." She had looked at him then, really looked, at the strong line of his jaw, the earnest set of his mouth, the way his eyes never wavered from hers even when the truth in them was frightening in its intensity, and she had known, with the sudden clarity of a lightning strike on a clear night, that she loved him. She had not said it. Not yet. The words had felt too large, too dangerous to release into a world that had shown her again and again how quickly good things could be taken away. But she had reached out and taken his hand, and he had held it as though it were the most precious thing he had ever been given, and that had been enough for that summer evening to speak what words could not yet carry. It was in September that everything changed. Wade Kingsley came back to Doverville. He came at night, of course, slipping into town under cover of darkness, the way he had learned to do in 6 years of living outside the law, and he came to the boarding house window that faced the alley, tapping softly until Minnie woke and let him in through the back door before the widow Halloway could stir. He looked older than his 28 years, worn thin by riding and hiding, a scar new since she had last seen him tracing a pale line along his jaw. But his eyes, when they found her in the lamplight, were still the same eyes she remembered from childhood, still holding that same fierce protectiveness that had shaped both their lives. "Minnie," his voice had cracked on her name. "God, look at you, all grown. Wade." She had thrown her arms around him despite every warning in her mind that told her this reunion, however sweet, courted danger for them both. "What are you doing here? Prute has men watching for you. If they find you, I know the risk." He had pulled back, holding her at arm's length, studying her face as though trying to memorize it against some future when he might not have the chance again. "I would not have come, except I heard something in Wichita that I needed to warn you about myself." "What is it?" "The Denton gang. You know of them." Minnie's blood had gone cold. Everyone in the territory knew of the Denton gang. 4 brothers and their cousins who had terrorized the plains between Kansas and the Indian Territory for the better part of 3 years, robbing stagecoaches and small banks with a viciousness that had earned them a reputation even Wade's own gang had never sought. "They believe," Wade had continued, his voice grim, "that I have hidden a substantial sum from the Abilene robbery somewhere near Doverville, and that you know where it is, or that I would come to you eventually and lead them to it. They have been watching this town for weeks, Minnie. I only just found out myself from a man who owed me a debt and decided to repay it with information. Do you have the money hidden here?" "No. It is buried 3 days' ride from here, in a place only I know." "But the Dentons do not know that, And they will not believe it even if I tell them. Because men like the Dentons believe every other man is exactly as greedy and cunning as they are themselves. They think I would have left it close where I could reach it easy, and they think you, as my sister, either know where it is or could be made to talk. Minnie had felt the floor tilt beneath her, the old fear of her childhood returning full force, the fear of men with guns deciding her fate without ever asking her opinion of the matter. How long do we have? I do not know exactly. Days, perhaps. A week at most if my information is good. Wade had gripped her shoulders, his eyes fierce with an older brother's desperate love. You need to leave Doverville, Minnie. Go somewhere they cannot find you. I have some money, not much, but enough to get you started somewhere new, somewhere with a different name. No. The word had come out of her with a force that surprised them both. I will not run again, Wade. I have spent my whole life running from the consequences of choices I never made. I am done with it. Minnie, these are not men like Prout, content to bully and threaten. The Dentons kill. They have killed before, and they will not hesitate to kill you if they believe it will get them what they want. Then I will need to be ready for them. She had said it with a calm that surprised her, drawing on some reserve of steel she had not fully known she possessed until that very moment. I have been practicing, Wade, with a pistol. I am faster than you would believe. Wade had stared at her as though she had grown a second head. You have been shooting. Since when? With whom? With a friend, a good man who taught me because I asked him to, because I told him I was tired of being defenseless. She had lifted her chin, the old gesture inherited from their mother. I am not the frightened girl you left behind 6 years ago, Wade. I have grown into someone who does not intend to simply hide from what threatens her. There had been a long silence in that dim lamplit room, brother and sister regarding each other across a gulf of years and choices, before Wade had finally spoken again, his voice softer now, almost wondering. You have become someone I hardly recognize, he had said, and I think perhaps someone I am prouder of than I have any right to be, given how little I have done to deserve credit for it. You gave me a roof over my head when you had nothing else to give, Minnie had said. That was enough, Wade. That was always enough. He had left before dawn, promising to send word if he learned anything more of the Dentons' plans, and Minnie had spent the rest of that night sitting by her window, watching the eastern sky slowly lighten, turning over in her mind everything her brother had told her. She had gone to Cornelius the next morning, finding him at the Lazy S corral checking the hooves of a lame mare, and she had told him everything, holding nothing back, because some instinct in her had decided that whatever came next, she did not want to face it with secrets between them. Cornelius had listened in silence, his jaw tightening progressively as she spoke, until by the end of her account his whole frame seemed coiled tight as a spring. The Denton gang, he had said finally, murdered a family outside of Newton not 8 months past, a rancher and his wife and their eldest son, all because the rancher would not tell them where he kept his savings. I have heard the stories. Then you understand why I cannot simply run, Cornelius. If they believe I might know something, they will not stop looking for me simply because I have changed my name and moved to another town. Men like that do not give up so easily. I understand. He had set down the horse's hoof gently, straightening to face her fully, his gray eyes dark with a fierce protectiveness that made her chest ache with love for him even in the midst of her fear. I understand, and I will not let you face them alone. Cornelius, this is not your fight. You did not choose to become tangled in my family's troubles. I chose it the day I stepped between you and Sheriff Prout, he had said, cutting her off with a gentleness that did not diminish the firmness of his conviction. I chose it every evening since, when I could have walked away and did not. I love you, Minnie Kingsley. I have loved you since before I had words for it, and I am not about to let the Denton gang or any other collection of villains take you from this earth while there is breath left in my body to prevent it. It was the first time either of them had spoken the word love aloud between them, and it hung in the morning air of the corral like something almost visible, almost solid enough to touch. Minnie had felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome given the gravity of their conversation, but unstoppable all the same. "I love you too," she had said, her voice thick. "I have for a long while now. I was only afraid to say it, afraid that loving something meant it could be taken from me." "Then let us be afraid together," Cornelius had said, reaching out to take her hands in his, "and let us face whatever comes with that fear beside us rather than letting it drive us apart." They had spent the following days in careful preparation. Cornelius had spoken quietly with Amos Sutter, the rancher who employed him, explaining enough of the situation to secure the old man's sympathy and a promise of extra hands should trouble come to the ranch or the town. Sutter, it turned out, had little love for the Denton gang himself, having lost cattle to their raids on more than one occasion, and he offered what support he could, including the loan of several rifles and a promise to alert nearby ranchers to keep watch. Minnie had continued her practice with renewed intensity, Cornelius drilling her not just on speed and accuracy, but on the harder lessons of gunfighting. How to read a man's stance for the telltale signs of an imminent draw, how to use cover, how to keep a clear head when fear threatened to overwhelm judgment. She had proven, again and again, a student of remarkable natural talent, her hands growing steadier and faster with each passing day until Cornelius himself, no novice with a pistol, found himself hard-pressed to match her speed in their practice draws. "You have become something remarkable," he told her one evening, as the sun set gold and heavy over the practice ground they had claimed as their own that summer. "I do not say that lightly, Minnie. In all my years on the plains, I have not seen a draw as fast as yours has become. I had a good teacher," she said, though the words felt inadequate to express the gratitude and love she felt toward him. "You had raw talent that needed only the smallest guidance," Cornelius corrected. "I merely showed you the door. You are the one who walked through it." Sheriff Prout, for all his earlier hostility, proved unexpectedly useful when word of the Denton gang's interest in Doverville reached his ears through his own network of informants. Whatever his faults, Prout was not a man who welcomed outlaws encroaching on his jurisdiction, and he grudgingly agreed to deputize several townsmen and coordinate with Cornelius and the Sutter Ranch hands on watches along the roads leading into town. "I do not do this out of affection for your brother, Miss Kingsley," Prout had told her stiffly, on the one occasion they had spoken directly about the matter. "But the Denton gang has caused enough trouble in this territory, and if they mean to bring that trouble to my town, I intend to be ready for them." "I understand, Sheriff, and I thank you regardless of your reasons." It was on the 11th day after Wade's warning, on a Tuesday morning that began like any other with the sun rising pale gold over the prairie, that the Dentons finally came. There were 6 of them in total, the 4 Denton brothers and 2 cousins who rode with them, all mounted on hard-used horses and carrying an arsenal of weapons that spoke to their violent trade. They rode into Doverville from the west, past the Sutter Ranch boundary, and it was one of Sutter's own hands, a boy of 16 named Jesse who had been assigned to watch that stretch of road, who spotted them first and rode hard for the ranch house to raise the alarm. By the time the Dentons reached the edge of town proper, word had already spread. Shopkeepers were pulling their shutters closed. Women were gathering children indoors. And Minnie Kingsley stood in the middle of the main street, Cornelius Fairchild at her side, both of them having chosen deliberately to meet the danger head-on rather than hide and wait for it to find them on its own terms. "You do not have to be the one to face them," Cornelius said quietly, his hand hovering near his own holster. "Sutter has sent word to Prout. The deputies will be here within minutes. They came for me, Cornelius, or for what they believe I know. If I hide, they will simply search until they find me, and innocent people may be hurt in that searching. Better to face them here in the open, where I can see them coming." The leader of the gang, a heavy-set man named Silas Denton with a face weathered into permanent cruelty, reined his horse to a stop some 30 yards from where Minnie and Cornelius stood. His brothers and cousins fanned out behind him in a loose formation that spoke to long practice at intimidation. "You would be Wade Kingsley's sister," Silas Denton called out, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "We have some business to discuss regarding your brother's ill-gotten gains." "My brother's business is not mine," Minnie called back, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "I do not know where any money is hidden, and even if I did, I would not tell men who murder families for sport." Silas Denton laughed, an ugly sound devoid of real humor. Brave words for a woman standing alone against 6 armed men. "I am not alone," Minnie said, and it was true in more ways than one. She could feel Cornelius beside her, steady as bedrock, and she knew that behind the shuttered windows and doorways of Doverville, men were readying rifles, preparing to defend their town against this invasion. "That drover beside you," Silas sneered, gesturing dismissively at Cornelius. "One man will not stop us, girl." "Perhaps not," Minnie said, "but I will." The words hung in the air, absurd on their face. A lone woman challenging 6 armed outlaws, and Silas Denton's laughter rang out again, joined this time by the crude chuckles of his brothers. "You," Silas said, incredulous. "A woman fast enough to face down the Denton gang. I have heard some foolish boasts in my time, but this, test it," Minnie said quietly, "or ride on and leave this town in peace." What happened next would be told and retold in Doverville for years afterward, growing in the telling the way such stories always do. But the essential truth of it needed no embellishment to be remarkable. One of the Denton cousins, a hot-tempered young man named Rafe, who had never possessed his elder relative's patience for negotiation, decided the exchange had gone on long enough and reached for his pistol, intent on ending the standoff through simple force. Minnie Kingsley drew and fired before his hand had fully closed around his own weapon's grip, her bullet striking the pistol clean from his fingers with a spark of metal on metal that sent the gun spinning harmlessly into the dust. The shot echoed down the street, and for a long, stunned moment, the entire Denton gang sat frozen in their saddles, staring at the young woman who had just demonstrated a speed and accuracy that few professional gunfighters could have matched. "The next man who reaches for a weapon," Minnie said into the ringing silence, her voice carrying a coldness that surprised even herself, "will not be so fortunate as to lose only his pistol." It was in that moment of stunned silence that Sheriff Prout and his deputies arrived at a gallop, rifles already raised, followed close behind by Amos Sutter and a half-dozen ranch hands equally well armed. The Denton gang, outnumbered now, and having just witnessed a demonstration of skill that unsettled even their considerable confidence, found themselves facing a defense far more formidable than they had anticipated. "This town does not welcome your kind," Prout announced, his rifle steady despite the visible fear that had shaken him initially at the sight of 6 known outlaws in his streets. "You will turn your horses around and ride out, or you will be arrested, or you will be shot. Those are your only choices here today." Silas Denton's eyes moved slowly across the assembled defenders, the sheriff and his deputies, the ranch hands with their rifles, the young woman who had just proven she could outdraw his own cousin, and the tall drover standing protectively beside her with his own pistol, now drawn and steady. The calculation in the outlaw's eyes was plain to see, weighing the diminishing odds of successful robbery against the increasing likelihood of bloody defeat. "This is not finished," Silas said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Wade Kingsley's money is out there somewhere, and we will find it eventually, with or without his sister's help." "You are welcome to search," Minnie said. "But you will do so far from this town, and far from me." The Denton gang wheeled their horses and rode out, west toward the horizon, leaving behind a town that had, in the space of a few tense minutes, watched a young woman transform from a suspected accomplice to outlaws into something closer to a legend. The story spread quickly through the territory in the weeks that followed, embellished and exaggerated as such stories inevitably become, until Minnie Kingsley's name was spoken alongside those of the era's most notable gunfighters. a woman who had faced down 6 armed outlaws without flinching, and had disarmed one with a single shot that many claimed, in the retelling, had struck the very buckle of his gun belt. Wade Kingsley himself heard the story secondhand, from a traveler passing through the Indian Territory, and he wept, alone in his hidden camp, tears of pride and relief that his little sister had grown into a woman capable of defending herself against the very dangers his own choices had brought upon her life. For Minnie and Cornelius, the confrontation with the Denton gang marked not an ending but a beginning, a public acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them through months of shared danger and quiet devotion. Doverville, which had once regarded Minnie with suspicion for her brother's crimes, now regarded her with something closer to awe, and by extension, regarded Cornelius Fairchild, the man who had stood steadfast beside her through it all, with newfound respect. Amos Sutter, in a gesture that surprised everyone including Cornelius himself, offered him a promotion to foreman of the Lazy S Ranch, along with a modest parcel of land as part of his compensation, land that Sutter had been considering selling off, but decided instead to grant to a man he had come to regard as trustworthy beyond question. "You have proven yourself steady under pressure that would break lesser men," Sutter told Cornelius, in the gruff manner of a man unaccustomed to expressing sentiment directly. "And you have shown good judgment in matters both practical and personal. I would be glad to have you tied more permanently to this ranch and to this territory." The land Sutter offered sat on a gentle rise overlooking a bend in the Smoky Hill River, with good grazing and a spring that never ran dry even in the driest summers. It was, Cornelius realized as he walked the boundaries of it for the first time, exactly the kind of place a man might build a home, might raise a family, might plant roots deep enough to weather whatever storms life brought. It was there, on that rise overlooking the river, on an October evening when the cottonwoods had turned gold and the air carried the first cool promise of autumn, that Cornelius Fairchild asked Minnie Kingsley to marry him. He had planned the moment carefully, or thought he had, bringing her to the land under the pretense of showing her the boundaries Sutter had granted him, walking with her along the riverbank as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple behind the distant hills. But when the moment came, all his careful planning dissolved into something far more simple and honest. "Minnie," he said, taking both her hands in his voice rougher with emotion than he had intended, "I have thought a great deal about what I want from this life, and I have come to understand that none of it means anything if you are not beside me to share it. I do not have much to offer you beyond this land and my own steady devotion, but I offer both without reservation. Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here on this ground, and let me spend the rest of my days trying to deserve the love you have given me?" Minnie felt the tears come before she could stop them, though these were tears of a different kind than any she had shed before, born not of fear or grief, but of a joy so complete it felt almost too large for her chest to contain. "Yes," she said, and then again, more firmly, as though the word itself needed reinforcing against any doubt. "Yes, Cornelius Fairchild. There is nothing in this world I want more than to build a life with you here on this land, for as long as we both shall live." He kissed her then, beneath the gold cottonwoods with the river singing softly behind them, and it felt to both of them like the closing of one chapter of their lives and the opening of another, infinitely more hopeful chapter yet to be written. They were married in December of that same year, in a small ceremony held in the Doverville church, with the whole town in attendance, come to celebrate the union of two people who had faced danger together and emerged not merely surviving but flourishing, their love tempered and strengthened by the trials they had shared. Wade Kingsley, against all reasonable caution, appeared at the wedding, slipping into the back of the church during the ceremony wearing a borrowed suit and a false beard that fooled no one who looked closely but sufficed to avoid immediate recognition from casual observers. He left before the reception, unable to risk staying longer, but not before pressing a small leather pouch into his sister's hands, containing a modest sum of money and a note that read simply, "For whatever home you build, I am proud of the woman you have become. Do not look for me, but know that I think of you always, and I am glad, more than words can say, that you have found a good man to share your life with. Your loving brother, Wade." Minnie wept reading it, standing in the small room behind the church where she had changed into her wedding dress hours before, and Cornelius held her while she cried, understanding without needing explanation the complicated grief and love that her brother's presence and absence both represented. "He will find peace eventually," Cornelius said softly, stroking her hair. "Or he will not, and either way, you have built something here that no one, not the law, not the Dentons, not fate itself, can take from you now." They built their home on the rise overlooking the river that following spring, a sturdy structure of timber and stone that Cornelius constructed with his own hands, assisted by Sutter's ranch hands and several of the townsmen who had come to respect the couple through the trials of the previous autumn. Minnie planted a garden along the south wall, where the afternoon sun lingered longest, and within its first season, it yielded tomatoes and squash and beans enough to fill their cellar for the coming winter. The ranch prospered under Cornelius's stewardship, the herds growing steadily as his reputation for honest, careful management spread through the territory. Minnie, for her part, found unexpected purpose in teaching, first informally when neighboring children would gather at the ranch house for lessons in reading and arithmetic, and later more formally when the growing settlement finally constructed a proper schoolhouse, and the community, remembering her courage and her evident education, asked her to serve as its first teacher. She continued to practice with her pistol, though the practice became more ritual than necessity as the years passed, and the territory around Doverville grew increasingly settled, the wild edges of frontier lawlessness gradually giving way to established order as more families arrived, more businesses opened, and the railroad finally extended its reach close enough to bring regular commerce and communication to what had once been isolated prairie. Sheriff Prout, whatever his initial hostility, became in time something approaching a friend to the young couple, his gruff respect for Minnie's demonstrated courage evolving into genuine appreciation as the years revealed her character more fully. It was Prout himself who, 3 years after that fateful confrontation with the Denton gang, brought news that the gang had finally been broken up entirely, its remaining members either killed in a shootout with federal marshals in the Indian Territory or captured and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. "Seemed only right you should hear it from me," Prout told Minnie, standing awkwardly in the doorway of the schoolhouse after classes had concluded for the day. "Given everything that happened between your family and theirs." "Thank you, Sheriff," Minnie said, and meant it, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she had not fully realized she still carried. Their first child, a son they named Elias after Cornelius's own father, was born in the autumn of 1880, in the bedroom of the house Cornelius had built with his own hands, with the widow Halloway serving as midwife and Cornelius pacing the porch outside, in an agony of worried anticipation that dissolved instantly into overwhelming joy the moment he was allowed inside to see his wife and newborn son. "He has your eyes," Cornelius said wonderingly, cradling the infant with the careful gentleness of a man handling something infinitely precious and slightly terrifying in his inexperience. "And your stubborn chin from the look of things," Minnie said, exhausted but glowing with a happiness that seemed to fill the entire room. "God help us all if he inherits both my temper and your persistence." "God help the world," Cornelius agreed, laughing, "but I suspect we shall manage well enough between us." 2 years later, their daughter Grace was born, followed by a second son, Thomas, in 1885, and the ranch house on the rise overlooking the Smoky Hill River grew fuller with each passing year, filled with the noise and chaos and boundless love of a family built from courage and devotion in equal measure. Wade Kingsley's story found its own resolution eventually, though not in the way either sibling might have predicted in those earlier, more desperate years. In 1883, weary of a life spent constantly looking over his shoulder, Wade turned himself in to federal authorities in Wichita, having negotiated through an intermediary lawyer a reduced sentence in exchange for information regarding several other outstanding robberies and the whereabouts of stolen funds still buried from his earlier crimes. He served 4 years in the Kansas State Penitentiary, a sentence that felt to Minnie both too long, given the years he had already suffered in hiding, and mercifully short compared to what a less cooperative approach might have earned him. She visited him twice during his incarceration, bringing news of her growing family and photographs, still a relative novelty in the territory, that showed Elias and Grace and eventually baby Thomas growing sturdy and healthy on the family ranch. "You built something good," Wade told her during one such visit, studying the photographs with an expression of complicated longing. "Something I never managed for myself. I am glad of it, Minnie. Truly glad, even if it took me too long and too much foolishness to understand what mattered most in this life. You gave me the chance to build it," Minnie reminded him gently. "Whatever else you did, whatever mistakes you made, you never once failed to try to protect me when it mattered most. That counts for something, Wade. It always has." Wade was released in 1887, and though he never returned to live in Doverville itself, understanding that too many painful memories and too much lingering suspicion would follow him there, he settled eventually on a small farm outside of Salina, close enough that visits between the siblings became a regular, treasured occurrence. He never married, seeming to carry always a certain weariness from his years of outlawry that made him hesitant to build the kind of family life his sister had found. But he found peace of a sort in simple farming, and he doted on his nieces and nephews with a fierce, protective love that echoed the devotion he had shown Minnie throughout her own difficult childhood. Cornelius Fairchild, for his part, continued to build the Lazy S Ranch into one of the most respected operations in that stretch of the territory, eventually purchasing additional land from Amos Sutter as the older man's health declined and his interest in active ranching waned. By 1890, Cornelius and Minnie owned outright the land they had first walked together as an engaged couple, along with substantial additional acreage that made their combined holding one of the largest family ranches in the county. But for all their material success, it was the quieter moments of their life together that remained, throughout the years, the truest measure of what they had built. Evening walks along the riverbank where they had first become engaged, now with children racing ahead of them, or, in later years, grandchildren too. The particular quality of light on autumn afternoons that reminded them both of that October evening beneath the golden cottonwoods. The steady, unspoken language of partnership that had grown between them through years of shared labor and shared joy and shared grief, for they were not spared grief entirely, losing an infant daughter to fever in 1888, a loss that tested their love and ultimately proved only how deep its roots had grown, how capable it was of bearing even the heaviest sorrows without breaking. "I do not know how I would have survived any of it without you," Minnie told Cornelius one evening in 1895, both of them gray now at the temples, sitting on the porch of the home they had built together, watching their grown children and growing grandchildren playing in the yard below. Elias had married a young woman from Salina and worked alongside his father on the ranch. Grace had become a teacher herself, following in her mother's footsteps, now working at the very schoolhouse where Minnie had once taught. Thomas had shown an early aptitude for veterinary work and had recently returned from studying with a doctor in Kansas City, intent on serving the ranching community's need for skilled animal care. "You would have survived it," Cornelius said, taking her weathered hand in his own. "You were surviving it long before I ever stepped between you and Sheriff Pruitt on that porch. But I am endlessly grateful that I did not have to watch you survive it alone, and that instead we were permitted to build all of this together. Do you ever think of those days? Minnie asked. The Dentons and Wade's warnings and all that fear. I think of them, Cornelius admitted, but not with fear anymore. I think of them the way a man thinks of a difficult winter that has long since passed into spring. They were part of the story that brought us here to this porch, to this life. I would not erase them even if I could, because erasing them would mean erasing the woman I fell in love with. The woman who stood in that street with a steady hand and a steadier heart, and dared 6 armed men to test her resolve. Minnie laughed softly, the same laugh that had surprised her on that first morning when Cornelius had defended her against Prute's harassment, still carrying after all these years the same quality of unexpected joy. I was terrified that day, she confessed. More terrified than I ever let anyone see. I know, Cornelius said. I could see it if I looked closely enough. But you did not let it stop you, and that, I think, has always been the truest measure of your courage. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate your choices. They sat together as the sun set behind the hills, the same hills that had witnessed their courtship and their marriage and the raising of their children. And Minnie thought, as she often thought in these quiet evening moments, of how far they had traveled together from that tense standoff on Doveville's Main Street to this peaceful porch, surrounded by family, secure in a love that had weathered every storm the territory had thrown against it. The Denton gang had long since passed into local legend, their story told now mainly to frighten children into good behavior or to entertain travelers passing through with tales of the territory's wilder days. Sheriff Prute had retired from law enforcement in 1889, replaced by a younger man who had grown up hearing stories of Minnie Kingsley's legendary standoff and treated her. On the rare occasions their paths crossed, with something approaching reverence. Wade Kingsley, now a gray-haired farmer with grandnieces and grandnephews of his own to dote upon, had found in his final years a peace that had eluded him through most of his difficult, outlaw-shadowed life. And Cornelius Fairchild and Minnie Kingsley, bound together by love forged in danger and tempered through years of shared joy and shared sorrow, continued to build their life on the rise overlooking the Smoky Hill River, their family growing, their ranch prospering, their love, if anything, deepening with each passing year rather than fading with familiarity. In the spring of 1898, 20 years after that first fateful morning, when Cornelius had stepped between Minnie and Sheriff Prute's harassment, the whole extended Fairchild family gathered at the ranch to celebrate the couple's 20th wedding anniversary. Elias brought his wife and their 2 young children. Grace arrived with her husband, a doctor who had settled in Doverville 3 years prior, and their infant daughter. Thomas, now married himself to a young woman he had met during his veterinary studies, brought news that he and his wife were expecting their first child come autumn. Wade Kingsley made the journey from his farm outside Salina, older now, and moving with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints had begun to protest the accumulated years, but present nonetheless, determined to celebrate this milestone with the sister who had built such a remarkable life despite, or perhaps because of, the difficult circumstances of their shared childhood. 20 years, Wade said, raising a glass of cider during the celebratory dinner that evening. The whole family gathered around a long table set up in the yard beneath strings of lanterns that cast warm golden light across faces marked by years of both hardship and happiness. 20 years since my little sister married the finest man I have ever had the privilege to call brother. I will not pretend I always believed such happiness was possible, given the shadow my own choices cast over her early years. But I have watched, these 2 decades, as she built something remarkable from circumstances that could easily have destroyed her, and I am prouder of her, and grateful to Cornelius beyond what words can properly express, than any man has right to be. To Minnie and Cornelius, the family chorused, raising their own glasses, and Minnie felt tears prick at her eyes as she looked around the table at the family she and Cornelius had built together, at the children and grandchildren whose laughter filled the evening air, at her brother who had finally found his own measure of peace, at the husband beside her whose hand found hers beneath the table with the same steady devotion he had shown from that very first morning 20 years before. "To all of you," Minnie said, when the toasts had settled and the family had returned to eating and talking and laughing, "for building this life with us, for every hard year and every joyful one. I would not trade any of it, not even the frightening parts, because they led us here, to this table, to this family, to this love that has only grown stronger with every trial it has weathered." Later that evening, after the children had been put to bed, and the extended family had retired to the guest rooms, and the small cabins scattered across the ranch property, Cornelius and Minnie walked once more along the riverbank where he had first proposed marriage 2 decades before. The cottonwoods, older now and grander, still cast their particular gold light in the evening sun, and the river still sang its familiar song against the rocks and reeds along its banks. 20 years, Cornelius said softly, echoing Wade's earlier toast, his arm around his wife's shoulders as they walked. "I remember standing right here, terrified you might say no, though I tried not to show it. I remember being certain the moment you asked that there was no answer in the world except yes," Minnie replied. "I had spent so many years believing that love and safety could not coexist, that any happiness I found would inevitably be snatched away by the consequences of Wade's choices or the cruelty of men like Prout or the Dentons. But you taught me otherwise. You taught me that love, real love, does not disappear in the face of danger. It grows stronger. It becomes the very thing that gives you courage to face whatever comes. You taught me the same," Cornelius said. "I was a solitary man before you, Minnie Kingsley, content enough with my own quiet existence, my work, my modest ambitions. I did not know, until I met you, how much richer life could become when shared fully with another person, when built together rather than endured alone." They stopped walking, standing together beneath the same cottonwood tree where he had proposed all those years before, and Cornelius turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his as he had done that autumn evening 2 decades prior. "I would ask you again if you would let me," he said. "Not because our vows need renewing, for I have never once doubted the strength of what we built together, but because I want you to hear it again, freshly, the same way you heard it that first time. I love you, Minnie Fairchild. I have loved you every day since that morning I stepped between you and Sheriff Prout, and I will love you every day for whatever years remain to us. And I consider myself the most fortunate man in this territory, in this whole wide country, to have earned the privilege of building this life alongside you." "And I love you, Cornelius Fairchild," Minnie replied, her voice thick with the particular emotion that comes from a happiness so complete it borders on overwhelming. "I love the man who defended a stranger against injustice without hesitation. I love the man who taught me to shoot not because he wanted a weapon in my hands, but because he understood my need to feel capable of defending myself. I loved the man who stood beside me against the Denton gang, unwilling to let fear separate us even when the danger was greatest. And I love now the man who has built this remarkable life with me, who has raised our children with patience and wisdom, who still, after 20 years, makes my heart quicken the way it did on that very first morning when you defended me on my own porch steps." They kissed then, beneath the same cottonwood tree, with the same river singing behind them, 20 years older but no less in love than they had been on that October evening when everything between them had finally been spoken aloud, and sealed with a promise neither had ever regretted keeping. The years that followed brought their own share of both joys and sorrows, as all lives eventually do. Wade Kingsley passed away peacefully in 1903, in his own small farmhouse outside Salina, surrounded by the family who had come to love him despite, or perhaps because of, the complicated and often difficult path his life had followed. Minnie held his hand through his final hours, grateful beyond measure that circumstances had allowed her these later years of reconciliation and closeness with the brother who had sacrificed so much of his own life trying, however imperfectly, to protect and provide for her. Amos Sutter had passed some years earlier, leaving the remainder of his ranching interests to Cornelius, whom he had come to regard as something closer to a son than a mere employee, cementing the Fairchild family's position as one of the most substantial and respected ranching operations in that corner of Kansas. Sheriff Pruitt, in his retirement, had mellowed considerably from the harsh, suspicious man who had once harassed Minnie on her own porch steps, eventually becoming something of a fixture at town celebrations and gatherings, telling stories to eager young listeners about the legendary day Minnie Kingsley had faced down the Denton gang, his own role in the confrontation growing steadily more heroic with each retelling. An exaggeration that Minnie and Cornelius found more amusing than irritating, as the years mellowed old grievances into shared local legend. By 1910, Minnie and Cornelius Fairchild had become grandparents many times over, their children having established their own families throughout the growing town of Doverville and the surrounding ranching country. The territory itself had transformed dramatically across the 3 decades of their marriage, the wild frontier lawlessness of their youth giving way to established towns, railroad connections, telegraph lines, and eventually, in the years following their 50th wedding anniversary, even the first automobiles beginning to appear on the dusty roads that had once known only horses and wagons. Through all this change, the ranch house on the rise overlooking the Smoky Hill River remained a constant, a place where the extended Fairchild family gathered for holidays and celebrations, where grandchildren learned to fish in the same river where their grandparents had once walked as young lovers, where the story of Minnie Kingsley's remarkable transformation from suspected outlaw's accomplice to the fastest and most respected gun in the territory continued to be told and retold. Not as a tale of violence, but as a testament to courage, to the possibility of building something beautiful even from the most difficult circumstances, and above all, to a love that had proven strong enough to weather every storm the wild territory had thrown against it. On the occasion of their golden wedding anniversary in 1928, with Minnie 72 years old and Cornelius 76, the whole family gathered once more at the ranch, now expanded across 3 generations, to celebrate a love story that had become, in its own quiet way, as legendary in Doverville as any tale of gunfighters or outlaws that the wilder days of the territory had produced. 50 years, Cornelius said, standing beside his wife on the same porch where they had spent so many evening hours across the decades, watching their vast extended family celebrate beneath the same cottonwood trees that had witnessed the beginning of their courtship. 50 years, Minnie, and I find myself no less amazed by you now than I was on that very first morning. 50 years, Minnie echoed, taking his weathered hand in her own equally weathered one, feeling the same warmth and comfort and steady devotion that had defined their partnership since its earliest days. And I would not trade a single moment of it, Cornelius Fairchild. Not the danger, not the fear, not even the sorrows we weathered together, because every moment led us here, to this porch, to this family, to this love that has only grown deeper and richer with every year we have shared. They watched together as their grandchildren played in the yard below, as their children gathered to reminisce about the family's history, as the sun set gold and warm over the ranch they had built together from nothing but hard work, courage, and an unshakable love that had first bloomed in the dangerous days of the wild frontier, and had grown, across 5 decades, into something as permanent and enduring as the very land they had chosen to call home. The story of Minnie Kingsley, the outlaw's sister who had become the fastest draw in the territory, would be told for generations in that corner of Kansas, a tale that captured perfectly the spirit of a frontier where danger and opportunity walked hand in hand, where courage could transform circumstance, and where love, real and lasting love, could bloom even in the harshest and most unlikely of soils. But for Minnie and Cornelius themselves, the legend mattered far less than the simple, profound reality of the life they had built together. A marriage of true partnership, a family raised with love and wisdom, a ranch that had prospered through their combined dedication, and a love that had never once wavered across 50 years of shared joys and sorrows, standing as testament to the enduring truth that the wildest frontiers of the human heart could yield the richest and most lasting treasures of all. As the golden anniversary celebration wound down into evening, and the extended family began settling into the various rooms and cabins that had grown up around the original ranch house across the decades, Minnie and Cornelius found themselves alone once more on their porch, the same porch where their courtship had first tentatively bloomed, watching the stars emerge one by one across the vast Kansas sky. "Do you remember," Minnie asked softly, "what you said to me that first morning when Prout was harassing me on the porch of the boarding house?" "I remember," Cornelius said. "I told him that if he had no evidence, that ought to be the end of it. You said something else after he left." "Do you remember that?" Cornelius thought for a long moment, searching through 50 years of memory for the specific words. "I do not recall precisely." "You said it did not seem right, letting it happen when you could stop it," Minnie reminded him. "That has been the truth of your character every day since, Cornelius. Whenever something has threatened what mattered, whenever injustice or danger has raised its head against our family, you have never once hesitated to stand between it and those you loved. I have built my whole life around the safety and strength of that promise, spoken and unspoken, across 5 decades now." "And you," Cornelius said, "have never once needed my protection more than you needed the freedom to prove your own strength. That has always been the truest thing about you, Minnie. Not that you needed saving, but that you chose, again and again, to stand and fight for what mattered, and simply allowed me the privilege of standing beside you while you did it." They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars multiplied overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their courtship, their marriage, the birth of their children and grandchildren, the slow transformation of the wild frontier into settled, prosperous country. 50 years had passed since that fateful morning, when Cornelius Fairchild had stepped between Sheriff Prout and a frightened young woman, standing alone against an unjust world. 50 years since Minnie Kingsley, the outlaw's sister burdened by her brother's reputation, had asked a kind stranger to teach her to defend herself, and had discovered in the process not merely a skill with a pistol that would become legendary throughout the territory, but a love that would sustain and enrich her for the whole of her long, remarkable life. The wild days of the frontier had given way, gradually and inevitably, to the settled prosperity of the new century. But the love between Minnie Kingsley and Cornelius Fairchild, forged in danger and tempered through decades of shared devotion, remained as vibrant and true in their golden years as it had been on that first spring morning, when a chance encounter on a boarding house porch had set in motion a story that would be remembered and cherished for generations to come. They died within a year of each other, Cornelius passing peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1932, and Minnie following him some 11 months later, having told her assembled children and grandchildren in her final days that she had simply grown tired of living in a world that no longer contained the man who had first taught her that love and courage could exist together. That safety did not require the absence of danger, but rather the presence of someone willing to face that danger alongside you. They were buried together beneath the same cottonwood tree where Cornelius had once proposed marriage, on the rise overlooking the Smoky Hill River, their headstone bearing a simple inscription that their children had chosen together. Together in courage, together in love, together always. The ranch they had built passed to their children and grandchildren, continuing to prosper across the decades that followed, a living testament to the remarkable love story that had begun in the dangerous, uncertain days of the Kansas frontier, and had grown, across more than half a century, into something as enduring and life-giving as the very land upon which it had been built. And in Doverville and throughout that corner of the Kansas Territory, the story continued to be told of Minnie Kingsley, the outlaw's sister who had become the fastest draw in the territory, and of Cornelius Fairchild, the quiet drover who had taught her, and who had loved her fiercely and faithfully across 5 remarkable decades, a love story as authentic and enduring as the wild frontier itself, and as gentle and lasting in its final measure. As the golden light of a Kansas sunset falling across cottonwood trees, standing sentinel beside a river that continued to sing its ancient song long after the 2 lovers who had once walked its banks had passed into legend themselves,